Palingenesis by Simon Harewood. Book 3, Heart of the Sear. Chapter 10. A Broken Man Made Whole. Gith, the Eye of the Dragon, was a bright white thread in the northern sky. Though Gareth knew it was a lie, that the star was not a dragon's eye at all, but the tip of the blade of stars, he could feel the memory of what he once believed blowing on the embers of his present fear. Was it not true that the wily dragon had conquered the old Nuria, had brought it down to powerless ritual and superstitions, and their legacy had been wiped from the sky and replaced with that abomination that now threatened to engulf all of the north with its flaming vengeance? Below it, the massive body of the creature sprawled across the dark north. Another lie, he thought. The headless man, Veer had called it, a judged criminal, with a sentence for his many crimes already carried out, and suspended above his frame a reminder and a warning, the bright blade of Viron. It all seemed so inevitable, an unavoidable fate, written in the stars. Had he ever had a choice, this Lord of Deceit? Was it not ingrained in his very nature to walk the course he had, to utter damnation? But who would execute judgment on him now that he had grown so irresistibly powerful? Had he succeeded in changing that fate? Changing those stars that spelled out his doom, now to reflect his power and domination of all living things? Could such things be rewritten, reinterpreted? Close to him he heard the breathing of the sleeping slave boys. Had they not been marked for death a little while before? Had they not, by taking action, changed their intended fate and escaped the terrible end planned for them? He sighed deeply. Perhaps they'd only postponed it. A whisper interrupted his gloomy considerations.
Still awake?
It was Rune. Gareth raised himself up on an elbow to stare at the recumbent form. The embers that remained of their small fire cast an amber glow over the sleeping figures all around. The man sat up. Apparently he was not even close to falling asleep.
I thought you would be tired after coming such a long way today.
Gareth shrugged.
So many things have happened. It is hard to believe that evil place is no more.
Rune looked at him curiously.
Is it a relief to you?
Yes. No one will be dragged down into the dark to be hurt there ever again. All those horrible contraptions are gone.
But the men who made them could just fashion some more.
That's why we have to go north, to help stop them.
Rune smiled wryly.
You still believe we can make a difference? I have no strength or ability with which to strive against dragons.
Gareth sat up now. His voice betrayed his eagerness.
That is why we have to go to the Sear first.
The man turned away to stare at the embers. A deep frown settled on his brow.
I am not convinced that it is the right course for me to take. Going to the towers.
Why would you hesitate to go there?
There was a long pause before he replied softly.
I am afraid.
What?
The boy stared at him with uncomprehending eyes.
Afraid? Of what?
The past?
He sighed heavily.
I will have to face the tally of all my cycles of madness.
The silence lengthened. Gareth sat in frustrated silence. He knew enough of regret and the painful past of this man to understand his fear, and yet he knew also the utter necessity to confront it. A small voice spoke up from the shadows behind him.
I am afraid all the time when I am by myself. Only when there are others who will be hurt. Then I sometimes forget to be afraid.
It was the boy, Brennick. Profoundly true, Rune thought. Considering the cost to himself, the humiliation and self-loathing that would follow confronting the stark truth, he was overwhelmingly intimidated. Yet he had gone back to battle the regrets and suffocating guilt for the sake of lessening the pain of his son. There was the source of courage he lacked. If he had to face the Sear, it would be for Gareth's sake and not Nuria's. If he had to face dragons, it would be for the sake of these thousands who had suffered, and not the willfully blind in their temples of corruption. His eyes met those of the boy now shyly peering out from behind his son.
Then I will think of others and forget also.
Gareth felt for the hand of this young stranger and squeezed it in silent gratitude. He breathed an inward sigh of relief. In these wandering, homeless remnants of his race, there were qualities worthy of redemption and self-sacrifice. The pale morning light found the Viron already stirring round their cooking fires. A new excitement prevailed after the tremendous event of the day before, in which the stronghold of their enemies had been overthrown, not to mention the appearance of the strangers in their midst. Those in close proximity to the newcomers could not help but steal glances ever so often in their direction. The account of the great blade and its new master was whispered in awed tones throughout the encampment, gaining in telling each time. Ere long, the multitude believed a champion of even greater stature than their Lund had come to their aid. As a result, the Northland grew just a little more fantastic and awe-inspiring. Lund found much of the former anxiety and apprehension abated once the newcomers joined the council. These ones knew the road ahead, and the unknown regions through which they would have to pass on their way to the realm of the winged man. The great column would no longer be stumbling in the dark, ignorant of the strength and whereabouts of the enemy. As soon as they had finished their morning meal, the council sat down to discuss the way forward. Janos painted a somewhat frightening picture of the lands between Tiralan and Nuria, also pointing out that the tour host would certainly stand between the refugees and their homeland. Rune filled in the gaps by describing what he had witnessed in Fenvale, emphasizing that it was very much a region under siege, and would be ill-prepared to sustain so many additional people. Only when Lund explained that the refugees were actually desirous to reach the realm of the Winged Man rather than any of the northern kingdoms, did the three newcomers change their concerned expressions to glance at one another with hopeful surprise. Gareth was the quickest to recover.
You want to go to Veer the Seer? We are on our way there too.
You mentioned it yesterday.
Lund said.
But why is it that you travel to the south when he is in the north?
Janos replied.
We came down to the great city because there is, or was, a gate there that would take you to the towers in no time at all, instead of the many days by road. This one,
He motioned in Gareth's direction.
saw you coming up from the south, so we moved to guide you past the city.
Saradwin spoke for the first time.
You believe this gate destroyed?
Janos appeared uncertain.
Who can say with such things? Yet with that tremendous blast, in all likelihood it no longer stands.
It would be worth having a closer look, exploring the place. Surely the danger is past.
Brithael asked. There were nods from the others.
Move your encampment to the north of the city as well.
Janos volunteered.
There were fewer tunnels made in that direction. If there are to be cave-ins, that would be the most stable area.
There would be no lack of volunteers for the scouting party. Everyone was curious to see the devastation up close. Lund organized several in the end in order to cover more ground. He had no intention of lingering in the vicinity of the Tour city. If there was no gateway here, they would have to hurry northwards by a different and more arduous route. In that case, there would be no time to lose. He left the moving of the camp to Brith and Lathan, leading one of the scouting parties himself. Not a single structure remained in the former city that could be identified, even if one had an intimate knowledge of the layout. Fissures, partially filled with rubble and blackened debris, ran this way and that, crisscrossing the landscape of devastation. Broken masonry from the shattered structures formed formidable obstacles in between. the scouts scrambled over piles of muddy brick and splintered wood. Already pools had formed in the marshy soil, sometimes containing grisly remains of the former occupants of Lakeside. Rune was reminded of the street scenes in the cesspool of the city, the disgust that had choked him among the specters he had encountered here. It was with immense relief that he explored the broken land where the slaves had lived their miserable lives, had suffered and died at the whim of a cruel, twisted master, had been robbed of all hope and dignity. Would that all such places would experience the cleansing fire that had consumed Mon Merrick. There was no discernible landmark to lead them in their search. Janos knew the former location of the portal. Lord Malik had moved it underground and had the terrifying roaming prince guarded against intruders. It was somewhere beneath the former palace, but that structure had disappeared altogether, crumbling into the catacombs below. A series of large craters seemed to occupy the space where the palace had been. These were not filled with water as yet, since most of the recent rain had drained into the tunnels and hollows below. Rune and his two companions picked their way down the rough slopes, astonished at the scope of the devastation. It was impossible to tell whether some of the massive underground caverns were still intact or not. Surely the great fire breather could not have survived the blast it had initiated. Still, the eerie silence and the evidence of violence all around made for an apprehensive descent. Gareth found himself consciously searching for the former queen of Nun Merrick. Nothing could have survived such tremendous destruction. He had seen the flames of the explosion climb high into the sky. Every creature in Lakeside would have been incinerated instantly. Yet she was no ordinary mortal simply to perish like the dregs of the marshland realm in this clay warren. Something ethereal, like the light of the distant stars, had lived in her eyes. All that patient sorrow, all that hollow anger and fearful regret could not have ceased with the passing of a mortal frame. Yet a fragile body could not have endured such tempests of fire. He wondered if she lingered still, somewhere close by, aware of her loss. Or did she wait in that silent vale for some sign from distant Myril before passing to the worlds beyond? He remembered a fragment from a dream, or some parchment he had not been supposed to read. No, it was Karth who had told him that the immortals might return to Myril if they chose to. Would she return, be born somewhere unaware and innocent? Would she grow up to be entranced by Malik once again? Perhaps she had no choice, and was bound to this place even as the old man, a prisoner whose crimes had to be expiated. How long would it take for her to come back? What kind of world would she enter with Malik in control? Down they went, into the maze of rubble and torn earth. Gaping holes marked ragged gateways into the darkness beyond. Gareth dragged his feet and soon fell behind his companions. Whispers seemed to spring from the deep shadows, as if the motives of those who dwelt here before still lingered, and would reach forth to harm by any means possible. He shuddered as the memories of the crypts crowded in, and the tightness gripped his throat again. Nameless fear settled on him. Rune and Janos were nowhere in sight. Then, as clear as the day, he saw the stone marker. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. Fear not the darkness. It was not a dream. This he knew, even as he realized it could not be tangible. Without hesitation, he stepped round the remains of a shattered column and clambered down into a dark fissure at its base. The pull was tremendous, irresistible. Shortly, he stepped into a cavern. Light from the fissure above fell on the sandy, rock-strewn floor. The twisted remains of a cage lined the far wall. At once he knew what it had housed. His heartbeat quickened at the sight, and he peered nervously into the deeper shadows behind him. This, then, was the place where the Dark Prince had lived out his deformed existence. There were traces still of his rage, his madness and humiliation. Had he been aware of his fallen state, Gareth remembered the tall warrior of another dream, the sad expression on Veer's face as he asked him not to return to Myril. But he had returned, only to be trapped by his father's schemes into a half-life of monstrous cravings and bestial brutality. Here he had broken free of that curse, knowingly or unknowingly, destroying the frame that had become his prison and the mother who had helped betray him into it. Gareth took a few faltering steps into the darkness. He reached out to touch the warped metal of the cage. A voice, strong yet unintelligible, broke through his thoughts. He looked up. Perhaps 20 yards away his eyes could discern the outline of a gateway. It stood on a rocky mound, solitary, and a few stones were missing from its round. The whispers multiplied in his thoughts, to such a degree that he almost missed the urgent touch from Rune.
Gareth!
It would have been amusing did he not sense the near despair behind the summons. He lost no time in replying.
What is it?
Where are you? Are you in danger?
I am at the gate, in a cavern just past the broken columns.
There was great relief in the reply.
Stay where you are. We're coming to you.
In a few moments he heard the footsteps descending into the fissure. 2 figures scrambled over the rubble and into the bright light from above. Rune peered about him, shielding his eyes with a hand. Janos stepped forward to grip the bars of the cage. His voice was low in the enclosed space.
This is the place.
Over here.
Gareth directed them to the archway.
This is it?
Rune sounded skeptical.
Oh, yes.
Janos ran his fingers over the battered stones as if to appreciate them better.
It appears to be damaged.
Rune pointed to where the stones were missing.
Will it work?
Janos flashed him a quick smile.
There is only one way to find out.
Gareth felt the excited beating of his heart. Beyond the stony arch lay the vale he had visited several times without ever setting foot in it. He was suddenly apprehensive about entering it physically. What would it feel like? Would the old man be waiting as usual? He had to find out.
I will go first.
Janos turned to smile on him.
If you must.
Rune was about to protest, but hesitated, not wanting to appear foolish and overly anxious. His objections might be misconstrued. He watched nervously as the boy strode into the archway with eager confidence. His concern turned to alarm as the child vanished from sight, even though he had expected it. Janos did not linger either, but stepped through immediately, without so much as a wink or a nod in his direction. For a few moments he stood staring at the space where he had seen them last, completely at a loss. Then he shrugged and, mumbling to himself, walked into the frame of stone. The place seemed real, to every sense, though he knew immediately that it was not. The sandy pathway, each loose stone or blade of grass, was as one would expect it. The soft carpet of needles under the sweeping boughs of the evergreens no doubt would yield to his exploring touch, yet he understood that these were not trees, or needles, or stones, that the qualities of such things had been conjured to mislead the senses into acceptance. The veil had Kale's signature all over it. He recognized the tingling discomfort so prevalent in the old man's quarters in Heron Inrath. They stood waiting for him, Janos and Gareth, the boy, for all his eagerness, now looking at him with large, apprehensive eyes. He merely nodded to them, and without exchanging a word, they headed up the pathway together. There was a physical presence in the veil. Kale touched the stone marker with his thought, and stood in the crossroads next to it instantly. Would the shadows still be making attempts to draw him here at this stage? What did Malik hope to gain by sending more of his minions to be broken in this place? He would show them no mercy. 3 figures moved up the pathway from Nun Merrick. They were not acolytes of the Dark One. A shock of recognition swept through him. A face from long before leading them, the physician of Luvinium, so much older than he remembered. Gareth, with a haunted look about his eyes, fetched from the bowels of Lakeside, and the Viron prince, whose ever-suspicious gaze now swept the trees about them and the gray sky above. His fingers rested lightly on... No! Cale stared in amazement. On the hip of the exile rode the blade of legend, the weapon hated and feared by Horan the impostor. How had they acquired such a treasure? He stood waiting for them now with the utmost difficulty. Since he had seen them last, all three had changed in ways immeasurable and profound. Cale remained hidden behind the marker and stepped out to bar their way only once they drew level with him. Sneaking through without paying our respects?
Cale,
Janos was the first to react.
what has happened to you?
I could ask the same of you, Janos. I believe you free of Myrtle and its concerns.
I told you from the start that I was here to see things through. It was both you and Malik who bent the rules, not so?
An awkward silence ensued, during which he became aware of the stares of the other two. The boy reached for him instinctively. He drew back and raised his hands. No, you cannot touch me like this. You have entered here in the flesh. This body is but a fabrication of the mind. Gareth stopped short, his eyes sparkling.
I'm so glad to see you at last.
Glad? After all you've been through? The boy seemed puzzled.
I don't understand.
Rune interrupted.
He means he knowingly sent you out with a madman into the jaws of danger, taking a gamble on your life.
The statement was an accusation, not exclusively aimed at Cale. Their eyes met. Cale nodded slowly. It is the truth. The boy backed off, open-mouthed with shock, looking from one to the other.
What gamble?
He would sacrifice you to gain me, though in the end his resolve deserted him, and he risked my life again to get you back.
Cale smiled wryly. You make it sound as if I had control over the situation. I risked, yes, but it was calculated. I knew Gareth is the child of the lament, the same as I knew you are the exile. What I do not know is whether either of you will survive this unfolding of that forecast. Besides, what kind of a life would you have when Malik rules all the lands around the inland sea? Rune shrugged.
I know about sacrificing others for my advantage. Have I not lived that way these many cycles? Does beating Malik mean everything to you?
Cale stared at him in disbelief. Do you really think that is just some private quarrel? Has that fiend not dragged all the peoples of this realm into it also? Do you believe he will be satisfied with besting me? Rune was about to reply when Janos interrupted.
See to the boy.
He pointed down the pathway to Lakeside, to where the figure of Gareth disappeared into the trees. Rune followed in haste, calling out his name. The boy did not try to elude him. He was leaning his head against the tree trunk, his face pale and wan. He spoke without looking at his father.
You were right. He deceived me. He used me. He does not care for me at all. All he cares about is his war with Malik and Helena. And whether I die or you...
He stumbled on the last word, gasping, overcome. Rune drew the trembling boy into an embrace, pressing the distraught face to his chest. Gareth did not respond. His arms remained limply at his sides like a puppet. Rune whispered into his hair.
That is not entirely true, you know. He did not have to tell me that you were still alive. Out on the sea, he could have let me believe that you were dead already. But he was willing to risk sending me after you to get you back, even though he knew the dangers. He would not have done that if he did not care.
The shuddering subsided. Gareth was listening to him.
Do you understand what I've told you?
There was a quick nod.
Can I let go of you now?
Another nod. Rune pulled back and held the boy at arm's length. Some of the pallor had left the face. He smiled and got a faint smile in return. On the way back, he kept his arm round the boy's shoulders. Gareth seemed to drag his feet. He mumbled under his breath.
I am such a fool.
Rune chuckled loudly.
You are the famous child of the lament, are you not? That entitles you to some foolishness, at least.
Gareth actually shoved an elbow into his ribs, but an embarrassed smile was back on his face. no longer there when they came up to the marker. Janos explained that he had urgent business to attend to in faraway lands and could not loiter here, exchanging pleasantries all day. They were not entirely convinced. He assured Gareth, though, of the old man's regret sincerely expressed for being instrumental in causing the boy so much suffering. Janos had taken the liberty of pointing out that the suffering had brought about much good, even his own release from imprisonment and subsequent escape from a fiery demise in Lakeside. He, for one, appreciated the risking of another's life.
And so do I,
Added Rune.
Were it not for you, I would be locked up in my self-delusion and hollow search for vengeance still. And now that everybody has said nice things about you, maybe you can try to feel a little better.
This time he was ready for the elbow. Janos led them to the tower's door. Despite his jesting, Rune felt the apprehension growing inside him. He only half understood the fear of coming face to face with the Seer. All these woeful deeds had been done for self-preservation and vengeance, but certainly he had been a victim also, and what was done to him undoubtedly outweighed what he had done. Or did it? He had no desire to be weighed and measured. The truth held no assurance of comfort for him. On the threshold he hesitated. Gareth grabbed hold of his sleeve and pulled him forward. They stepped through together. They were in a cavern once more, or a large room with stone walls. The doorway stood on a small dais with 3 steps leading down to the floor. In sharp contrast with the well-kept quarters of the keeper, Gareth remembered, this room was layered in the dust of the ages. The portal had not seen extensive use in a very long time. 2 sets of footprints led to and from the dais. Both curved away in the direction of a doorway directly opposite, above which blazed the amber outline of a chrysolite's eye. Just inside the doorway stood a lone figure. They were expected. As they descended the steps, the figure moved forward to meet them. From his slender form, Gareth understood that it was not the keeper, but a veteran. When they could make out his features, there was a smile of recognition. It was Sith, who had cared for him on that first flight from Nuria so many seasons before. The veteran addressed them in friendly tones.
The keeper bids you welcome.
He nodded at them.
He will speak to you this evening at supper. Until then, you may refresh yourselves and take your leisure in the guest chambers prepared for you, if you will follow me.
Rune looked at his companions quizzically, as if he did not quite trust all these preparations made by strangers. Gareth merely returned the smile of the small man in front of them, while Janos seemed perfectly at ease, so once more he followed their lead without raising an objection. The chambers mentioned by Sith were quite roomy and well furnished. The bedchamber contained 4 large beds prepared for the guests. An adjoining salon boasted a low old wood table and comfortable chairs. A small washroom had been readied also with warmed water and towels. Rune looked about him with amazement.
Where is this place?
Janos appeared puzzled by this question.
You are in the towers, of course. Have you never been here?
Rune did not bother to reply. There was no way to explain the mystification and demonizing of all things concerning the art to someone who had not been around for the last 600 cycles.
Wherever this is, we cannot stay here. Our packs are still in the marshland. Lund and the rest probably wonder what has become of us. Now that we have discovered the way here, we need to bring them through also.
I don't know if Veer's prepared for so many,
Gareth observed. He had flopped down in one of the chairs and stretched out his legs to put his feet on the table.
Veer the Seer not prepared?
Janos sounded incredulous.
There are thousands of them.
Gareth remarked.
He couldn't have supplies to feed so many.
You are right,
Rune said.
Perhaps we should talk to him first before we guide that horde in here.
He sat down in a chair. Some of the apprehension ebbed away, since there had been no immediate confrontation at the gate. Janos appeared thoughtful.
I will go back to Lakeside to fetch our packs, and tell the Veron there to await our return in the morning.
In his absence, Rune plied Gareth with questions regarding their host. He did not know whether the information he gleaned in this way was reassuring or not. In the end, he decided the waiting was not good for his nerves, and he went to lie down on one of the beds. Hours later, he woke from a deep sleep. Janos had returned. He heard the voice of his companions conversing in the salon. Soon they were joined by the Vadran, coming to fetch them for supper. He rose up slowly and stumbled to the washroom. Cold water would revive him. He bent his head over the basin and poured the entire jug of water over it. Sighing with satisfaction, he reached for a towel. The sleep had done him good. Rune strode back into the salon, feeling in control again. He found Gareth barring his way, staring at him, a smug little grin on his face.
Why are you looking at me like that? Are you about to be presented as High Quester?
The boy actually had to bite his lip not to burst out laughing.
You talk to me. In your mind.
What?
In the rubble of Lakeside. Before we came here.
Rune frowned at him, annoyed.
I was concerned. You could have been... Do you want to make something of that now?
The boy did not reply. He flung both arms round the man's chest, hugging him tightly. Rune stood staring in astonishment, his mouth still open, ready for argument. Now he directed his wonderment at Janos, who merely rolled his eyes in return. Sith led them through a series of corridors to the council room. Everything here appeared unchanged to Gareth. Perhaps the scrolls and maps were more ordered than before. A fire blazed in the hearth. The guests were instructed to sit down at appointed places. Rune found himself facing the empty seat of their host, with Gareth on his right and Janos on his left. Two more Vadran entered with steaming dishes, which they proceeded to place on the table. It was a mouth-watering sight to those who had seen nothing but improvised trail fare for so long. All eyes turned to the doorway as Kenneth finally made his appearance. Despite his resolution to the contrary, the strangeness of this man affected Rune deeply. He saw Gareth hesitate also. This boy, who always acted on impulse, was uncertain in addressing the keeper of the towers. It was Kenneth who spoke first, perhaps noticing the discomfort.
Well, Gareth, you cared enough to return after all. You would aid the people who turned you out?
Rune recognized the Gareth of his first acquaintance so many seasons before in the reply.
I do not return for what they are, but for what they should be.
Kenneth stood silent for a few moments, as if he pondered this remark deeply. Then he turned to Janos.
You are welcome once more, old friend. It seems the reasons for your previous haste were sound. Here now we have the fruits of your labors, for which I am deeply indebted to you.
Janos merely inclined his head without replying. The pale eyes of their host finally fell on Rune. An almost imperceptible shudder passed through him. Only Gareth, who was expecting it, noticed. The voice now changed also, betraying some of the shock of that snowy mountainside encounter, as well as sad resignation in the face of inevitable outcomes.
Ah, Prince Rune, you arrive in the nick of time. I was despairing and hoping that you would not come after all, though the despair was much greater than the hope, as the good of all is greater than that of the self.
There was a pause. Rune, for once, found himself at a loss for words. There was too much of that disconcerting awareness of otherness about. He felt intimidated and threatened, like during his first interviews with Kale. Kenneth continued.
I know what it cost you to come here, and I know what it will cost me. Confronting the darkness within ourselves takes the ultimate courage.
He smiled suddenly.
That confrontation we may continue in the morning. For now, enjoy the meal.
It was some time after midnight when Rune felt the touch on his shoulder, stirring him at once to wakefulness. One of the Vadrans stood by his bedside and motioned for him to follow. He dressed hurriedly in the dark, and leaving his companion still sleeping, left the room quietly. Tunnels and stairs sloped down into the heart of the mountain. Rune lost track of time or direction. He offered no protest, for he realized the season of truth was at hand. He had faced the many accusers of his past on the sea more than a 10-day before. The opportunity was here to lay them to rest. Finally, after what seemed hours, they arrived in a vaulted cavern, the size of which he could not estimate. His silent guide spoke a few strange words Rune could not decipher. Chrysolite inlays along the walls, in places reaching up into the domed ceiling, were illuminated. He was reminded instantly of the temple in Belruth, though that far place lacked much of the latent power settling around him now. Some of the symbols he recognized: the Swan of Stor, the Ship of Ingerval, even the Arrow of Karth's household on Heron Inrath. But there was no dragon for Belruth or air tree for Gilreth. Instead, the Amber Eye appeared regularly, and a symbol shaped like a blade that appeared to represent a constellation of stars. They reached what seemed to be the center of the cavern. A simple stone, rough and out of place, stood on a raised platform. On it was an inscription in chrysolite letters.
Here beginneth the search.
The initiate's course, thought Rune. Why in the name of Imran had he been brought to this place?
Wait here.
The small man told him, before walking back the way they had come. The silence was near complete. At the edge of hearing, he half imagined an occasional dripping noise, and perhaps the scurrying of small feet in the dark niches out of sight. Soon the light from the crystals began to fade, leaving a ghostly glow that lingered momentarily round the stone with the inscription before disappearing altogether. When the darkness became absolute, and the dominant sense of sight was thus rendered suddenly obsolete, other avenues of understanding, those fainter trails that led to less obvious truth, preferred themselves above the calculated weighing of cold reason. With nothing to do but wait, Rune found himself pondering the events and decisions that had brought him to this place. He was certain of but one thing: that mad course that had been his way of life since the exile had been altered forever. The enormous burden of the past seemed no more than a nightmarish memory of entanglements beyond his control. It was true, what he had said so lightly in the portal veil. Someone had found the key to his prison, and had cared enough to set him free. Yet remained a burden for the future, a lack of direction, no clear course of action in a world that was in the last throes of tempestuous change. Did he simply want out? He had never been one to stand by and let events take their own course. Even more so now that he was aware of just how much those events were being manipulated. He was not at peace with himself. Now that the sun had risen upon him again, he knew that his turning would not be complete with the rescue of his dream only. The Seer came to him. He was aware of the presence without the need for sight or sound to confirm it. When at last the voice spoke to him, it was almost as if he heard it inside him, a touch of the art.
Do you know who I am?
I do.
The darkness will serve us for now, for what must be done.
I understand.
It is needful to pose a few questions. Answer them in word or thought, as you are able.
There was a slight pause. Rune waited for further instructions.
Draw the blade you were given by the slave boy. Kneel in front of the stone. Keep both hands on the hilt and place the tip on the ground between your body and the stone. Compose it.
Rune did as he was bid. He was apprehensive when he placed the blade tip on the ground and felt for it with his mind, remembering the fearful struggle in the Viron camp the night before. As on that occasion, the sweat started on his body, and his heartbeat pounded in his ears. The blade was a foreign thing, battling against his mastery of it. He spoke his frustration aloud.
Why does it resist me?
The response was immediate, as if his difficulty had been expected.
The blade does not want you. You cannot strike with all its potential until you are in harmony with its motive, the motive with which it was fashioned. If you strike for your own preservation, or with vengeance in your heart, even only in anger or frustration, the true heart will never be revealed. But when all things are aligned, it will come to life, drawing from the potential of those who watch over Myril, touching the frozen heart of Imran, and perhaps finding an echo there of the place from where he has fallen. You can see, I trust, why it takes more than a mere strong man to use it. It takes a broken man made whole again. Such a one alone can mirror the motives that made this world and brought immortals to its frame as prisoners.
Rune lowered his head and fought against his instincts. He had manipulated blades all his life by force of will alone, drawing from them the potentials of construct only. As he had come to suspect, that post-cleansing Nurian way of imposing one's desire on the chrysolite had little to do with the true potential of the weapon. Much of that old manipulation was second nature to him now, but would not aid him in unlocking the secrets he was now convinced were within his grasp. When the questions came, he did not attempt to answer them at first, but rather meditated on them, searching for responses beyond the surface of his conscious thought.
What will you do with the gifts you have?
What would he do? What had he done? The vanity, the waste of lives, the boastful, self-centered bitterness in which he had exulted.
What is the legacy that you uphold?
He was disinherited in Nuria, exiled. What did he represent now? Certainly not the house of Albarad, built on falsehood and willful ignorance. What did his own house stand for? The depraved life of a pirate lord? I am disconnected, he thought. I know nothing of my true origins.
What is the cause that you champion?
Cause? Retribution? Justice?
What gives you direction and determines your course through Myril?
Love, my first dream, those I care for.
What have you done with the life you received?
What have I done? What has been done to me, forcing me into dark contemplations and darker deeds? I cannot be held responsible for the choices I made.
And Athera? What about the errors of judgment, the recriminations, the fierce hate? He had committed so many crimes in the name of that self-deception. At last he found an answer to give.
I have squandered that life in ignorance and pride, in needless violence and cruelty. I have hated and brought much harm, always justifying my actions. I have been accountable to no one, until now.
Will you be accountable to me?
I will.
Then face the totality of your crimes.
The voice spoke without anger or accusation, even with a quality of sad regret, and the hearer could not doubt the beneficent intention conveyed. It reached up into the dark above him, bringing an echo back as if many others were whispering in its wake.
You have brought me shame. You have tainted my honor in this world. You have used my gifts in anger, for your own gain and spite, in injustice and vile sport. You have hated without reason, betrayed the closest trust, waded deep in blood for the basest of motives.
The words flowed on, and he did not resist them. Instead, he opened again the darkest doors of his past in a rash sweep, till he felt more vulnerable than a sentenced criminal before his executioner. Yet there was an odd comfort in the pain, for here was a place at last where he could tear free from his self-contempt, the correction of a parent, the acceptance of a chastised son. Even when the tears came, as they had done at the sight of his son's supposed lifeless form, he found them not disgraceful or degrading, but liberating, leaching away the turmoil and anguish too long suppressed. The tendency to legitimize his rash actions grew ever fainter, then faded altogether. He no longer had a need for the clinging excuses, the fallacies of the past to prop up his meaningless existence. When the probing questions resumed, even more confrontational in nature, it was a simple thing to find the responses.
Do you renounce your claim for vengeance on your brother? Do you renounce your claim for vengeance on your wife?
I have renounced it. Fingor is dead, Athera is dead, and the rune that was died with them.
He continued unbidden.
Somehow the fierce love I had for her survived in the form of our son, who unknowingly I despised and unknowingly I loved. It seems inconceivable that love could weather so many storms and burn the brighter for it, as it seems incredible that I should stumble on the proof of it after so many dark days. But I have the strength now to embrace it, and the bitter dream that was my life in exile is no more.
There was a perceptible change in the tone of his questioner. Some of the neutrality had departed.
Do you abandon the course you have followed during your exile?
I turn my back on it. All my old life, the footsteps I have walked, I do abhor it now.
The question ceased. He was suspended in the silence, the darkness. His eyes searched for the spark in the dead blade in front of him, but there was no stirring, no reaction. He could not claim it. In desperation, he appealed to the now silent onlooker.
Tell me what I should do.
Veer's voice was distant now, thoughtful.
The blade in your hands was given to Fenwith. There is no other like it. He left an imprint on it during those frantic seasons fighting for survival against the Tuor and their foul perversion. It is unique for that reason, and for its size and quality. The song at its heart can bring forth power like no other. It carries memories of destroying the dragon, of correcting that manufactured flaw in the fabric of Myrol. To unlock its potential, in effect, means to become the man who first wielded it.
The next words were spoken from somewhere close by, as if the speaker was standing directly behind him.
This is the only true Sear blade. Others have borne that name since. Ceremony and ritual have presented many Viron with such. They were called Sear blades, but that is not correct. There is only one true Sear blade, the first one ever fashioned. The blade you used to carry was called that because it has a similar shade at its heart. All men crave the name, but they, like you, have wielded in their impotence the construction called In, after the first flame.
There was a light touch on his shoulder.
I will leave you now. If you have the ability to find the heart, you will have to discover it for yourself.
The hand retreated.
Stay here in the darkness until the crystals light up for you and point out to you the way back. By then you will know what must be done and the cost required for achieving it.
Gareth turned over restlessly. He opened his eyes and glanced at the bed next to his. It was empty. He half expected it to be. Somewhere in that vast realm of the Seer, Rune had heard the summons. He sighed with satisfaction and went back to sleep. The beast was huge, far bigger than he could have imagined. The horror of it gripped him till his breath was tight and small within him. But the true fear of his heart lay with the crumpled figure at the base of the statue. He dropped the bow from his numb fingers, his knees already weak with the realization. To confirm it was unbearable yet unavoidable. The fallen warrior, sprawling lifeless against the wall, did not wear the cold, stark face of Kale, but the face of his father. He had persuaded Rune to come here, to this place, to fight for Nuria. He had done it, and this fight would cost him. It was too hard to contemplate. He woke with a suffocating sorrow, his heart drumming erratically. He could not survive the death of this one. He would not. If the dragon would steal away this life from him, he would surrender his own also. He could not suffer the separation it would bring, however great the cause. In the dark he lay staring, his resolution firm. He had gained his mother for an hour, just to lose her. It would not be the same with his father. Rune remembered the vigil of his boyhood after receiving the blade in the Belruth Temple. That had been the mockery, a childish game without significance or importance. How devoid of understanding, how pitiful they were in Nuria, in their blind ignorance and unfounded pride. It was a shame even to be associated with such a legacy, deceived and doomed beyond redemption. And he had felt so cheated, so utterly deprived when they had cast him out, the masters of that diseased realm. He was unworthy of Fenwith's legacy, unworthy to bear the name of Viron, to be numbered among those who expressed the art in fulfillment of unselfish dreams. Those who had gone before would not allow his sullied hands to wield such potency as now trembled between them. In front of him, as clearly as he had seen it the night before, appeared the rapturous face of his son. In his hands was the very sword now contended for.
This belongs to you. They have found it, and it is yours to claim.
He stared as he had on that night.
Take it!
The voice insisted. He would do it. For the sake of the boy and his wronged, wretched mother, for the sake of his own squandered, shameful life, he would struggle with these spirits and wrestle for the inheritance of his people. Whispers invaded his thoughts from the dark all around, crowding in like that night upon the silent sea. All that was stolen from you.
If you turned around only for me, why are you still restless here?
You have been robbed of purpose. All at once he was on a foreign shore, in the flowing breeze of a sun-tide night. Overhead the stars leaned down upon him in unfamiliar patterns. Had he fallen asleep? He brought a hand up to his face. Certainly he was no longer kneeling by the stone. He took a few steps over the sand. It did not seem to be a dream. A voice reached to him out of the dark, at once familiar yet profoundly different. It spoke within him as well as without, and the words were images more than sounds evoking meaning. The pictures flowed one into the other, leaving impressions not needing rational explanations. There was the face of a woman that he knew at once, a paralyzing sadness in her eyes, and a tremendous longing to undo the injustices heaped upon her. Overwhelming regret seemed to find a voice, an embodiment, till the face changed to that of a young boy whose eyes pleaded for acceptance from the darkness of a crypt. And he knew then that his life, his pride, his happiness had no meaning outside the heeding of that plea. But the dark pressed in upon him in fields of peril, creatures stirring under the driving whips of fire in the sky. A great fear broke upon him, rising like a stormy ocean tide, and the darkness was filled with the beating of mighty wings, the towering might of the beast, and the swirling fire of its hate. He knew instinctively that it possessed no strength to match this great demon. Yet there was no thought of flight, only the inevitability of his destruction. It was wounded, the voice told him, vulnerable, and he knew there would be only one chance, one strike, and that he would have to expose himself to all that power in order to deliver it. The power to take a life was in his hands. The power, the sin, the curse of killing, branded him forever as an outcast, tainted his being with a shadow that no penance could remove. Even to preserve life, even to protect the weak and free the innocent, he's made a monster to destroy the monster in others. But he would bear this burden for the sake of those who could not. Rune became aware of himself once more. His grip on the hilt of the mighty blade was so fierce, both hands were cramping painfully. He relaxed the fingers one by one, till finally the weapon fell from his grip and the bright amber in its center faded to a dull glow. He sat back, leaning against the stone wall behind him. His knees hurt from kneeling so long on the hard floor. He closed his eyes against the throbbing in his temples, and once again the urgent images flashed before him. There was no doubt any longer. He would have to face the Lord of Shadows in his most terrifying form. Could he succeed where Imran had failed? If he gave himself without reserve? He whispered the pledge to the emptiness around him.
Let me seal it with my life.
From the walls and hidden alcoves, the dome and silent stone came a whispered response.
No lesser pledge can be accepted.
In the distance, an amber chrysolite eye was kindled. Ranald led the northern campaign against the remaining Tyndall rebels in person. The king lost no time in pursuing the scattered tribesmen into the hills they had entered after the abortive siege of Rosfarin. He required a quick settlement in the north if he was to prevent the tying down of much-needed men and resources for seasons to come. The Tyndall, hiding among the scraggy hills and mounds of their homeland, retreated before the king's troops. They had lived through similar situations and would use the only strategy left them. From their hilly hideouts they would strike out with war bands and raiding parties, cutting supply lines and causing havoc in the rear of an army campaigning across the pass, stealing livestock from the farms around Rosfarin and Grin's Keep, ambushing travelers and merchants on the northern road, and holding up after to divide the spoils. However, the newly formed alliance with the Inrathians and Gilrith necessitated great haste. Ranald's energetic campaign into the Moundsman heartland was mostly a demonstration of his resolve. Already the king's proposals for a settlement had reached the tribal chieftains, the majority of whom had been coerced into the Oath of Blood. Lord Kael's agent Uthard delivered the terms to the separate dens and strongholds within a day. In exchange for the heads of Yennig and his strange man Rost, the Aranite king would halt his punitive expedition, forego any claims to damages suffered by the inhabitants and farmers of Rosfarin, and grant a full pardon to any and all who participated in the uprising. The chiefs had one day to respond. Meanwhile, the king's soldiers were everywhere, and with them contingents of impressive-looking, mostly dark-skinned foreigners wearing the slanted silver arrow on their chests. They occupied Klimoth and seized control of all supplies and foodstuffs. The people were forced to queue for their rations, now received from the occupiers. What men there were of fighting age were incarcerated almost immediately. The chief's house and that of Rost were utterly destroyed in ritualistic burnings, but no other dwelling was touched. Neither were ordinary tribespeople harshly treated. Ranald could not help being touched by the poverty and squalor he witnessed in the township. When the surrender of the tribes had been secured, and if it were possible to ward off the dark threat from across the sea, the situation among these unfortunates would have to be addressed. The mounds would remain a breeding ground for discontent and rebellion otherwise. The very first evening of their arrival, the ultimatum to the chieftains would expire. Evrain fervently hoped that the terms had been accepted. A prolonged struggle with these people would only reinforce the bitterness and hatred already smoldering. As he walked the dusty streets of Plymouth, he vividly remembered his previous stay in this place. He noticed that many of the townsfolk recognized him, since they would stare at him fearfully as he walked by, averting their eyes guiltily as soon as he returned their gaze. Perhaps they believed he had come back for revenge on Yennig and Rost, who had incarcerated him here in their hillside prison. He smiled to think that the circumstances had been reversed so quickly. Now it was the two leaders hiding in the mounds, fearing for their lives. He made his way to what had been the strange man's abode. Ranald and his nobles were there already. Raelf stood waiting with folded arms, leaning against the blackened pillar of the doorway where the hideous faces had been all but erased. Oddly, Evrain could still feel the palpable threat of that soothsayer's gaze from the time he had passed judgment on them. The object of his malicious interest had been Gareth, of course, a dark ritual involving the boy and that enigmatic ancient from Tyrallen, who now threatened all the lands with conquest and who knew what shadowy fate. Ranald nodded to him as he took his place at the king's side. The sun was about to set, and there had as yet been no envoy from the Tyndall to make an appearance. Would they defy the King of Arran as they had done so many times before? Would they risk losing face in front of their warriors and wives by bowing to the wishes of Ranald, whom many still called a foreign duke instead of sovereign? The results could be devastating for many, not least the hard-pressed peoples of the eastern shore. Imran's orb touched the western horizon. Evrain glanced at his cousin, the king, whose expression remained impassive. Perhaps there would be no miracle here this day. Almost all the townspeople, even the detained males, who were brought out for the occasion, were watching anxiously. What would this forceful young king do if he did not get his way? The sun was slipping away quickly now, casting its last golden rays over the gathering. Raelf snorted loudly and muttered something about moundsman mentalities. A dog barked suddenly, causing a stir, and was silenced. But the bark had been one of excitement and recognition. A figure had appeared, wending its careful way towards the square. It was a Tyndall warrior, unarmed, with two Arranite soldiers in attendance, hurrying him along. The man carried a sack over his shoulder. All the necks craned to allow their owners a glimpse. Whispers started everywhere. Even Raelf stopped his irritated muttering and pressed forward to Evrain's side. The warrior walked with lowered head, a picture of dejection, and glanced sideways at the people, as if he knew they regarded his present action as utterly shameful. As soon as he reached the royal party, he dropped to a knee and bowed his head almost to the ground. His speech was timid and nervous.
Great King, I bring tidings to your gracious majesty from your humble and loyal servants.
Raelf actually laughed out loud at this, causing the man to cringe away from them. Evrain was beginning to feel sorry for the poor envoy. Past rebellions had been dealt with most severely. There had to be an expectation of retribution and brutal vengeance. The man was exceedingly filthy. Evrain looked at him closely. Despite his adopted lowly manner, there was something familiar about him. The leather cap, the neatly plaited forked beard, it had to be the same man who had interrupted his travels the previous Suntide, nearly causing him and his companions to lose their lives in the bargain. He remembered the name still.
Ger?
The cowering figure looked up, and a shudder of recognition passed through him. He suddenly reached up his hands and shielded his face, dropping the sack behind him with a sickening thud. His screech betrayed mortal fear.
Don't kill me! I only did what they told me. I didn't know what they intended. I swear it! I swear it!
Evrain noticed there was no more trace of his formerly heavy accent. This fellow had spent much time in Aeronite company. Perhaps that was why he had been selected as the envoy. Ranald looked on with puzzled amusement. He turned to Evrain.
You know this man? I do. We met on the road sometime last. It was he who persuaded me to visit this scenic place.
He addressed himself to the frantic man.
Stop your howling, man. We are not in the habit of harming envoys. Speak your business to the king.
Gare seemed to have lost all pretense of bravado. He wailed pitifully.
I begged them not to send me. One of you is sure to do for me, and I have yet to earn the right to marry.
Ralph muttered that he would be glad to oblige him then and there if he did not pull himself together at once. Gare appeared to be too distressed to hear him. Ranald spoke in irritation.
What is the answer of your chiefs to my proposal? Do they accept?
Gare nodded briefly, yet he seemed no less perturbed. There was a relieved sigh among the nobles. Men looked at one another, smiling.
Then what are you wailing about?
Ranald pointed to the sack.
You have the proof of their good faith with you.
The man made no move to reach for this proof. He kept looking from Evrain to the king and back again, as if he expected either of them to draw a sword on him forthwith. Ralph finally had enough. He stepped forward, grabbed the sack, and upended it before them. A single grisly trophy rolled out of it. He grabbed the head by its hair and lifted it high, shaking it a little, as if to force a confession from the dead lips. His voice confirmed their suspicions.
This is Yennik. Where's the other one?
Now that his dreadful secret was out, the envoy seemed to regain some of his nerve. He looked forlornly at the king, a man sentenced already. His voice was resigned.
This strange man has fled. Nobody knows where he is. All the chiefs beg the great king's pardon and beseech him not to blame them for something they cannot remedy.
Ranald turned to Evrain.
This is unexpected. Do you think they are playing a game with us?
Evrain considered this carefully. He shook his head.
I think not. They would have nothing to gain by sheltering this man who is not even one of their own. He was feared by them, not liked or admired. I believe he has returned to his master now that the scheme here has miscarried.
Ranald nodded in agreement.
Wise words, cousin. I will accept these terms.
He turned to Gare, who was still kneeling, staring dejectedly at their feet.
You may return to your chiefs and bear them this message. Each one is to present himself before me at Grin's Keep within 5 days from today. There I, as their rightful overlord, will release them from this illegal oath of blood, forced on them by the thralls of others. They may reaffirm their loyalty to Aaron and be reinstated till the next darkening, after which they have to relinquish their titles in favor of an heir of their choosing. Failure to appear within the appointed time will result in being outlawed for life, without the possibility of a pardon. Any man who will bring me their heads may then inherit their titles and privileges.
Gare listened disbelievingly at first, but soon understood that he would be allowed to escape this predicament. He looked at the Aaronite lords eagerly, as one would at great honors about to be bestowed. The change was so startling and abrupt that Ralph shook his head, turning away in disgust. When the king concluded, he waved at the guards.
Take him away, feed him, and make him comfortable for the night. Tomorrow he may return to his people with our message.
At this, a frown of suspicion creased the envoy's brow. There was no opportunity to argue, though. Already the heavy hands of the soldiers were upon his shoulders, lifting him to his feet. Ranald turned back to Evrain, a little smile of satisfaction on his lips.
Well, cousin, a few days in Grin's Keep for us, and then the pass and Nuria. I have to admit my strong curiosity to see that land for myself.
The very same night, on the eastern shores of the inland sea, Lord Malik of Taralan's scouts entered the city of Nicoma in Ligurium. As expected, there were no signs of life anywhere within the walls and fortifications. It was apparent also that the city had been thoroughly looted. There was some grumbling at this, for they knew the brigands from the east would leave no easy pickings for them all the way north into Viron. Quickly they slipped up the northern road and explored to the west along the line. The farmsteads they encountered were abandoned and pillaged. The swarm had done its work, even in the countryside and among the hovels of the hamlets. It was as though the former Ligurium had been swallowed up entirely by this voracious beast. By the first watch, they returned to the city, recrossed the clearing, and delivered their report to the waiting host. All was in order and just as had been expected. No prying eyes would report their arrival, no power would challenge their entry. The former shield of Viron had been shattered. Soon the long columns were on the march again, trudging wearily across the King's Bridge under cover of night. First came the lightly armored warriors, hand-picked southerners, the cream of the Gudrid Empire's fighting men. They sang as they trotted along in 500 formations, each 100 strong, every 10th man carrying a torch aloft, a sea of flame invading the north. Behind them were more hundreds from the swamplands, the Fez, the Fever Coast, Monborg, and the former kingdom of Lysan, as many as their southern allies, but a far less uniform group. They ranged in quality from mere roadside thugs to the well-trained raiders that had halted the Ligurian invasion of Lysan the previous cycle and destroyed the host under Duke Morlan. Their equipment and formations were just as diverse. Club-wielding bands marched along in a rabble that resembled a riotous mob on market day. Spear and bowmen moved silently in orderly formations. Their experience and extensive training reflected in quiet confidence, well-kept armor and weaponry. Tall, stooping figures were mixed in with the rest, their dull eyes vacantly staring ahead. Even greater hulks came in the rear of these formations, muzzled and chained, each with a handler, trudging along with their vast, loping strides. Mile upon mile of carts and wagons followed, drawn by oxen or slaves, even man-like beasts from far afield, such as had never been seen in the region. Dry rations and supplies rode in the carts, the figures of men in the wagons. Here, hidden from casual glances, the tour battle priests, the dark lords and their faithful attendants, and the great captains of the host took their leisure and awaited the opportunity to display the gifts they had honed for so long. The dark Loctii slept among them, for the day of battle would require all they had to give. Half a league behind the last cart marched another formation. Long lines of armored bodies surrounded the lurching transport of the Swamp Lord. A cohort of warriors, taller by a head than their fellows, of greater potency and strength, went directly in front and behind. These wore no armor on the march, but short hooded cloaks, shielding them from the light that was and would be again on the morrow. Red eyes peered from the deep shadow, glowing with the expectation of a long-awaited hour of vengeance. Their bulk and measured movements testified of the tempered ferocity, the tremendous destruction they could mete out among the enemy. The formation numbered close to 10,000, their blackened blades and dark-stained gear set off by the pale hue of their features. By the time this last procession rumbled their stately way over the King's Bridge, the sun pushed its weary way through the morning clouds in the east. There would be shelter and rest for man and beast among the dwellings of Nicoma. Orin's captains were everywhere, directing the horde into temporary quarters, creating order amidst the noisy bustle. All had to be settled and silent for the entry of the Great One. The tour host had crossed the clearing into Ligurium. The master of the wastelands had returned, set foot again beyond Vindar's line, where officially he had not trod for 1,000 cycles. Finally, his claim to these northern lands would be irresistible.